think the idea of eliciting an emotional response from people is ultimately what one hopes to achieve, and whether the work is abstract or not. If it is abstract, then I tend to think that people are more or less forced into a position of measuring themselves against what they're looking at. What had attracted me about abstract art was that, for one thing, it's a wonderfully risky business. It's both demanding to make, and it's demanding on the viewer. But if people have the patience on either end of that spectrum to deal with it, it can be the most powerful and kind of direct experience.
We have decided at the National Gallery to do a retrospective on Robert Murray. Well, first because he had a very prestigious career, and it falls right into our intention to study better the history of sculpture in Canada. And Robert Murray is a very good case to illustrate this study, because he was installed in New York since 1960, and as we know, New York became the most important international center for art.
You know, I came out of an era of what I call Victorian art appreciation, where they hung a black and white millet on the chalkboard wall, and you had to write 25 words or less before recess about well, it's enough to absolutely damage anybody's appreciation for painting, let alone millet. Having grown up, or having gone to school in Regina, with teachers that had been to the States, at least for part of their own education, I suppose it predisposed me to an interest in American art that might not have been the case if I'd gone elsewhere. Roy Cayuca also joined the staff at one point, and it was his enthusiasm for Mexico, for example, that persuaded me to go there. But Art Mackay wrote and encouraged me to come back in time for the Barnett Newman workshop. Went to New York the following year for a year and forgot to come home. Well, one of the things that attracted me about New York was, mind you, it was through reproductions and the art magazines and not any actual contact with their work in any physical sense, but I was very taken by the direction that the New York school represented. And it was, to my mind, the most powerful painting that was being done. And that was part of the motivation for going to New York, was to see it firsthand.
When he first moved to New York and started painting of Barnett Newman, this is how, in fact, he decided to pursue the venue of sculpture instead, because after you have seen what Barnett Newman has done, it was difficult to conceive that you can do something else in painting. But I think he found his way in sculpture. And in fact, what he's bringing is the plane of color. He's bringing that in actuality, in sculpture, in the real space.
But David Smith seemed to be the powerhouse in terms of sculpture. However, I also liked Calder's work a lot. The Stabiles in particular were a big influence on me. The last year I was in school in Regina, there was a large Lipschitz exhibition had come through, and that was also interesting to see. And I later got to meet Lipschitz. My interest in sculpture was also based on archaic work as well. I liked Egyptian sculpture. And then Brancusi, of course. I just thought Brancusi was terrific. A lot of my sculpture has to do with dualities, often a kind of dialogue that takes place between two dominant aspects of the work. A piece like Ferris, its basic components are a cylinder and a flat slab or a plank-like form, and their interrelationship and the space they create sort of between them. So the angularity and the stability or the lack of stability, the imbalance, these things become literally the subject of those pieces. I like to be responsible for inventing the forms myself. I like to work with flat metal often or with stock shapes that I then alter and form to arrive at the particular nature of the piece. Well, my main reason for turning to industrial processes was largely due to the fact that I didn't have the place or the equipment to build my first piece of sculpture. After I moved to New York, I went back to my painting, but I wasn't there long before I got involved first with a bronze foundry and then later with a metal fabricating plant called Tritel Graz. And on occasion I've worked with places like Bethlehem Steel Shipyard in California, which was an enormous plant, and that was very exciting in itself. And then I guess to complete the picture, by the mid-60s is when Don Lippincott got his operation started in New Haven, Connecticut. And what was unique about that is that it was the first fabricating plant devoted solely to making sculpture. So he put a crew together that was basically there for whichever artist was in residence at the time, and that was terrific. The basic kind of equipment that I end up using is, in addition to the rolling mills, are large brake presses, hydraulic brake presses. It's brought down against the metal with sometimes hundreds of tons of pressure, and it will form more or less straight lines across the metal. What happens with some of the work, a piece like Saginaw, for example, is that in order to get it into a brake press, we have to cut it into a lot of pieces. And most of the aspects of the work are segments of cones, whereas a piece like Cumbria was formed primarily by bending straight across the metal. Then, of course, there's changes of materials. Because I use color on almost all my work, people aren't often aware that it's aluminum rather than steel, or the other way around. I didn't mention bronzes, but some of the work is cast. A piece like Sue has a large piece of bronze plate that was formed cold in a brake press, the way I fabricate a lot of my work. The supporting elements were originally made from oak, and then later cast in bronze through the sand casting process. It's a solitary process, even though other people may be involved in the making of a piece of sculpture. Ultimately, the kind of decisions that you're making and your own inner thoughts about what you're trying to achieve are, however, always very private. I very seldom have any fixed idea about the color before I begin a piece. The models are not usually painted any particular color. And I generally rely on getting some kind of an impulse somewhere along the way when we're fabricating the sculpture about what color it wants to be. In the case of some pieces like Nordka, Haida, Dyad, they seem to tell you they want to be a deep blue. Other pieces like Taku and Megan's Red and so on, or Saginaw, some particular kind of red. I think Saginaw worked out particularly well. It's a kind of a coolish red that changes a lot in different lights.
Robert Murray is a great sculptor, but he's as well, he has a good sense of color, and all his working career he has tried to improve on the colors he's using and to render them more complex. And in fact, recently the patina that he has worked upon for his bronzes are absolutely amazing, very pastel patinas, which seems to be dyed in the metal itself.
Well, choosing names for abstract work, whether it's a painting or a sculpture, is a bit difficult. I've resorted generally to using place names. I also like the idea of using North American native names, or at least as they've come down to us. The piece that went to External Affairs was named Haida, and for no specific reason. It's just, again, I like the name, and I've always been very interested in Northwest Coast native art. However, because of all the publicity about the sculpture, I got a letter from one of the chiefs of one of the heads of the Haida Federation asking me in no uncertain terms why I had called the sculpture Haida. My response was a very diplomatic letter indeed, and I tried to make it clear that it was out of respect for his culture and had no other implications, and that I wasn't one more white man trying to steal his culture. But I appreciate that it at times can be a sensitive issue. I've always been interested in who was there first, and there's something about that idea of making contact with the art of early peoples. It's always fascinated me. I'm not entirely sure why. A number of years ago, I bought a teepee for my daughters. It's something, in truth, I'd always wanted to own myself. At any rate, it made me aware of the fact that perhaps on some subliminal basis that this form had been a part of my work all along. And I eventually sort of gave into it and started using the form somewhat more literally. It is kind of abstract or architectural in its own right, so that it doesn't carry any heavy literary message with it necessarily.
When I look at it, it represents only a piece of metal. I still look at it and I can't see anything.
You don't see anything?
No, there's no letters, there's nothing. So I think a lot of people like me wondering what it is.
I immediately thought of the ocean. And I don't know if it's because of the shape or the color, but I really thought of water. And it's just, I think it's beautiful. I think it brings a feeling of calm to the space.
I've seen it every day, but I never really noticed it. I guess for me, either I don't understand modern art, or I'm not sure what, but
One of the big mistakes, I think, has been to label this activity as public art. Until the public starts making it, it's not public art, in my opinion. It's private art put out into public situations. The truth of it is that for the most part, you almost worry more that the work is too easily accepted and won't be provocative enough to challenge people and to really make them think hard about what they're seeing. My first piece of sculpture, as I mentioned earlier, was a commission, so I didn't know any better. However, I found out very quickly when you're answerable to, in this case, a group of city fathers, and then when the debate brings in the press, that you've got a lot on your plate to contend with besides making the sculpture. It's interesting that when the Nimbus controversy started, this is the work that was commissioned by the National Endowment for the Arts and the Alaska State Council on the Arts for a piece of sculpture to go in front of a new court building in Juneau, the capital of Alaska. The piece had about a 3 or 4 month period of relative tranquility. It was when the state legislature went back into session that fall that all hell broke loose. The tragedy of these kind of situations is that the knowledgeable people who often select the artist for these projects are nowhere to be found when these controversies erupt. The fact that Nimbus ended up being moved and relocated to in front of the State Museum, that in itself didn't bother me. Cumbria and Vancouver was a slightly more complicated situation. The airport authorities, they ordered its removal rather crudely with some heavy equipment that seriously damaged the sculpture. The work was restored to the extent that we rebuilt it, and then another site was found for it, and it has since gone to the University of British Columbia. But you have to have a pretty thick skin. Well, I think the best way to approach anything that one doesn't understand or hasn't had experience with is to start out with what's obviously in front of you. The suggestion I often make to people is to have a little dialogue with themselves. I mean, what is it made out of? You know, what is its size? What is its color? And literally say these things to yourself, you know, kind of analyze what you're seeing and see then what kind of response you have to those descriptions. But the idea that we should be able to step up to a work of art and demand of it instant gratification is not likely to happen. It doesn't happen with much that's serious in our world. It really shouldn't happen with good painting and sculpture either, or people shouldn't expect it to.
To fully understand the work, you really have to walk around it and experience it. There is no other way. You can't understand the work if you don't do that. So I think the sculpture wants that, wants to have the single viewer to be challenged, and so that, you know, he walks around it to understand its complexity, because it can be quite deceptively simple when you look from afar, but far from the contrary, the work itself is very complex.
People are an important aspect of the work. They kind of complete the cycle. That you, without the viewer, the process is not really complete. This is the most recent project that I have on the go. It's a piece of sculpture that I'm building for the Canadian Institute for the Blind in Toronto. And the idea is that this will be set up in the garden behind the CNIB headquarters on a specially designed path, and people will be able to walk around it and reach in and handle most of the work from any given side of the piece. After the small aluminum model, I moved on to a same size model. This represents about a fifth of the overall sculpture. What's also useful about modeling out the work on this basis is that, like the cardboard that began flat and was formed, the steel goes through the same transition. It starts out being flat and will end up being made into volumes. So it has an east-west orientation. Some of the forms I've tried to capture idea of islands and fjords and hills and low mountains and drumlins and river systems and the grid of the prairie and the foothills and the various aspects of the mountain ranges in Alberta and British Columbia, and then finally ending up with this sort of bookend effect of Vancouver Island. I hope people aren't going to hold me to any literal interpretation of the geography, but it's, I suppose it's obvious on a certain level, and it's a level beyond which I really don't want to go, because I'm more interested in these as abstract forms. And I think for anyone who's familiar with my work, you can recognize the origins of a lot of these pieces. This is, I guess, the last little touch that's come to stand for my signature. Represents a yellowbird, a name I was given by some native friends that really, I suppose, has to do with the fact that I've always flown yellow airplanes. I used to worry to some extent that I had far too many interests to be an artist. I finally reached a point in my life where I began to appreciate that these interests inform what I do in my sculpture and my painting. And that while perhaps I do spend too much time working on my airplane now and then, nonetheless, these things all end up providing you with your own personal point of view. I think that, you know, being an artist is just about the most interesting preoccupation anybody could be involved with. It's been a kind of an amazing life for me. I'm constantly surprised at things that happen to me and opportunities I've had and opportunities I hope I'll have.